That's what I want to try and see if one couldn't do. It would be jolly handy to train oneself to be some good in the dark. Now, Tuppence, be a good Sydney Thames. How many steps to that cane? Tuppence made a desperate guess. 3 straight, 5 left, she hazarded. Tommy paced it uncertainly, Tuppence interrupting with a cry of warning as she realized that the 4th step left would take him slap against the wall. There's a lot in this, said Tuppence. You've no idea how difficult it is to judge how many steps are needed. It's jolly interesting, said Tommy. Call Albert in. I'm going to shake hands with you both, and see if I know which is which. All right, said Tuppence, but Albert must wash his hands first. They're sure to be sticky from those beastly acid drops he's always eating. Albert, introduced to the game, was full of interest. Tommy, the handshakes completed, smiled complacently. The keyboard of silence cannot lie, he murmured. The first was Albert, the second, you, Tuppence. Wrong, shrieked Tuppence. Keyboard of silence indeed. You went by my wedding ring. And I put that on Albert's finger. Various other experiments were carried out, with indifferent success. But it's coming, declared Tommy. One can't expect to be infallible straight away. I tell you what. It's just lunch time. You and I will go to the Blitz, Tuppence. Blind man and his keeper. Some jolly useful tips to be picked up there. I say, Tommy, we shall get into trouble. No, we shan't. I shall behave quite like the little gentleman. But I bet you that by the end of luncheon I shall be startling you. All protests being thus overborne, a quarter of an hour later saw Tommy and Tuppence comfortably ensconced at a corner table in the gold room of the Blitz. Tommy ran his fingers lightly over the menu. Pilaf tahomad and grilled chicken for me, he murmured. Tuppence also made her selection, and the waiter moved away. So far, so good, said Tommy. Now for a more ambitious venture. What beautiful legs that girl in the short skirt has, the one who has just come in. How was that done, Thorne? Beautiful legs impart a particular vibration to the floor which is received by my hollow cane. Or, to be honest, in a big restaurant there is nearly always a girl with beautiful legs standing in the doorway looking for her friends, and with short skirts going about, she'd be sure to take advantage of them. The meal proceeded. The man 2 tables from us is a very wealthy profiteer, I fancy, said Tommy carelessly. Pretty good, said Tuppence appreciatively. I don't follow that one. I shan't tell you how it's done every time. It spoils my show. The head waiter is serving champagne 3 tables off to the right. A stout woman in black is about to pass our table. Tommy, how can you dash? Aha! You're beginning to see what I can do. That's a nice girl in brown just getting up at the table behind you. Snoll, said Tuppence. It's a young man in grey. Oh, said Tommy, momentarily disconcerted. And at that moment 2 men who had been sitting at a table not far away, and who had been watching the young pair with keen interest, got up and came across to the corner table. Excuse me, said the elder of the 2, a tall well-dressed man with an eyeglass and a small grey mustache. But you have been pointed out to me as Mr. Theodore Blunt. May I ask if that is so? Tommy hesitated a minute, feeling somewhat at a disadvantage. Then he bowed his head. That is so. I am Mr. Blunt. What an unexpected piece of good fortune. Mr. Blunt, I was going to call at your offices after lunch. I am in trouble, very grave trouble. But excuse me, you have had some accident to your eyes. My dear sir, said Tommy in a melancholy voice. I am blind, completely blind. What? You are astonished? But surely you have heard of blind detectives? In fiction. Never in real life. And I have certainly never heard that you were blind. Many people are not aware of the fact, murmured Tommy. I am wearing an eye shade today to save my eyeballs from glare. But without it, quite a host of people have never suspected my infirmity, if you call it that. You see, my eyes cannot mislead me. Good, enough of all this. Shall we go at once to my office, or will you give me the facts of the case here? The latter would be best, I think. A waiter brought up 2 extra chairs, and the 2 men sat down. The second man, who had not yet spoken, was shorter, sturdy in build and very dark. "It is a matter of great delicacy," said the older man, dropping his voice confidentially. He looked uncertainly at Tuppence. Mr. Blunt seemed to feel the glance. "Let me introduce my confidential secretary," he said. "Miss Ganges. Found on the banks of the Indian River a mere bundle of baby clothes. Very sad history. Miss Ganges is my eyes. She accompanies me everywhere." The stranger acknowledged the introduction with a bow. "Then I can speak out. Mr. Blunt, my daughter, a girl of 16, has been abducted under somewhat peculiar circumstances. I discovered this half an hour ago. The circumstances of the case were such that I dared not call in the police. Instead, I rang up your office. They told me you were out to lunch, but would be back by 2:30. I came in here with my friend Captain Harker. The short man jerked his head and muttered something. By the greatest good fortune you happened to be lunching here also. We must lose no time. You must return with me to my house immediately." Tommy demurred cautiously. "I can be with you in half an hour. I must return to my office first." Captain Harker, turning to glance at Tuppence, may have been surprised to see a half-smile lurking for a moment at the corners of her mouth. "No, no, that will not do. You must return with me." The gray-haired man took a card from his pocket and handed it across the table. "That is my name." Tommy fingered it. "My fingers are hardly sensitive enough for that," he said with a smile, and handed it to Tuppence, who read out in a low voice, "The Duke of Blairgowrie." She looked with great interest at their client. The Duke of Blairgowrie was well known to be a most haughty and inaccessible nobleman who had married as a wife the daughter of a Chicago pork butcher, many years younger than himself, and of a lively temperament that augured ill for their future together. There had been rumors of disaccord lately. "You will come at once, Mr. Blunt," said the Duke, with a tinge of acerbity in his manner. Tommy yielded to the inevitable. "Miss Ganges and I will come with you," he said quietly. "You will excuse my just stopping to drink a large cup of black coffee? They will serve it immediately. I am subject to very distressing headaches, the result of my eye trouble, and the coffee steadies my nerves." He called a waiter and gave the order. Then he spoke to Tuppence. "Miss Ganges, I am lunching here tomorrow with the French prefect of police. Just note down the luncheon, and give it to the head waiter with instructions to reserve me my usual table. I am assisting the French police in an important case. The fee he paused is considerable. Are you ready, Miss Ganges?" "Quite ready," said Tuppence, her stylo poised. "We will start with that special salad of shrimps that they have here. Then to follow, let me see, to follow, yes, omelette blitz, and perhaps a couple of tournedos 6-1 étranger." He looked up, catching the Duke's eye. "You will forgive me, I hope," he murmured. "Ah yes, souffle and surprise. That will conclude the repast. A most interesting man, the French prefect. You know him, perhaps?" The other replied in the negative, as Tuppence rose and went to speak to the head waiter. Presently she returned, just as the coffee was brought. Tommy drank a large cup of it, sipping it slowly, then rose. "My cane, Miss Ganges?" "Thank you. Directions, please." It was a moment of agony for Tuppence. "One right, 18 straight. About the 5th step, there is a waiter serving the table on your left." Swinging his cane jauntily, Tommy set out. Tuppence kept close beside him, and endeavored unobtrusively to steer him. All went well until they were just passing out through the doorway. A man entered rather hurriedly, and before Tuppence could warn the blind Mr. Blunt, he had barged right into the newcomer. Explanations and apologies ensued. At the door of the Blitz a smart landaulet was waiting. The Duke himself aided Mr. Blunt to get in. "Your car here, Harker?" he asked over his shoulder. "Yes. Just round the corner. Take Miss Ganges in it, will you?" Before another word could be said, he had jumped in beside Tommy, and the car rolled smoothly away. A very delicate matter, murmured the Duke. I can soon acquaint you with all the details. Tommy raised his hand to his head. I can remove my eyes shade now, he observed pleasantly. It was only the glare of artificial light in the restaurant necessitated its use. But his arm was jerked down sharply. At the same time he felt something hard and round being poked between his ribs. No, my dear Mr. Blunt, said the Duke's voice, but a voice that seemed suddenly different. You will not remove that eyes shade. You will sit perfectly still and not move in any way. You understand? I don't want this pistol of mine to go off. You see, I happen not to be the Duke of Blairgowrie at all. I borrowed his name for the occasion, knowing that you would not refuse to accompany such a celebrated client. I am something much more prosaic, a ham merchant who has lost his wife. He felt the start the other gave. That tells you something, he laughed. My dear young man, you have been incredibly foolish. I'm afraid, I am very much afraid that your activities will be curtailed in future. He spoke the last words with a sinister relish. Tommy sat motionless. He did not reply to the other's taunts. Presently the car slackened its pace and drew up. Just a minute, said the pseudo-duke. He twisted a handkerchief deftly into Tommy's mouth, and drew up his scarf over it. In case you should be foolish enough to think of calling for help, he explained suavely. The door of the car opened and the chauffeur stood ready. He and his master took Tommy between them and propelled him rapidly up some steps and in at the door of a house. The door closed behind them. There was a rich oriental smell in the air. Tommy's feet sank deep into velvet pile. He was propelled in the same fashion up a flight of stairs and into a room which he judged to be at the back of the house. Here the two men bound his hands together. The chauffeur went out again, and the other removed the gag. You may speak freely now, he announced pleasantly. What have you to say for yourself, young man? Tommy cleared his throat and eased the aching corners of his mouth. I hope you haven't lost my hollow cane, he said mildly. It cost me a lot to have that made. You have nerve, said the other, after a minute's pause. Or else you are just a fool. Don't you understand that I have got you in the hollow of my hand? That you are absolutely in my power? That no one who knows you is ever likely to see you again? Can't we cut out the melodrama? Asked Tommy plaintively. Have I got to say, you villain, I'll foil you yet? That sort of thing is so very much out of date. What about the girl, said the other, watching him, doesn't that move you? Putting two and two together during my enforced silence just now, said Tommy, I have come to the inevitable conclusion that that chatty lad Harker is another of the doers of desperate deeds, and that therefore my unfortunate secretary will shortly join this little tea party. Right as to one point, but wrong on the other. Mrs. Beresford, you see, I know all about you. Mrs. Beresford will not be brought here. That is a little precaution I took. It occurred to me that just probably your friends in high places might be keeping you shadowed. In that case, by dividing the pursuit, you could not both be trailed. I should still keep one in my hands. I am waiting now. He broke off, as the door opened. The chauffeur spoke. We've not been followed, sir. It's all clear. Good. You can go, Gregory. The door closed again. So far, so good, said the Duke. And now what are we to do with you, Mr. Beresford Blunt? I wish you'd take this confounded eyes shade off me, said Tommy. I think not. With it on, you are truly blind. Without it you would see as well as I do, and that would not suit my little plan. For I have a plan. You are fond of sensational fiction, Mr. Blunt. This little game that you and your wife were playing today proves that. Now I too have arranged a little game, something rather ingenious, as I am sure you will admit when I explain it to you. You see, this floor on which you are standing is made of metal, and here and there on its surface are little projections. I touch a switch so. A sharp click sounded. Now the electric current is switched on. To tread in one of those little knobs now means death. You understand? If you could see, but you cannot see. You are in the dark. That is the game, blind man's buff with death. If you can reach the door in safety, freedom. God, I think that long before you reach it you will have trodden on one of the danger spots. And that will be very amusing for me. He came forward and unbound Tommy's hands. Then he handed him his cane with a little ironical bow. The blind problemist. Let us see if he will solve this problem. I shall stand here with my pistol ready. If you raise your hands to your head to remove that ice shade, I shoot. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, said Tommy. He was rather pale, but determined. I haven't got a dog's chance, I suppose. Oh. That dash, the other shrugged his shoulders. Damned ingenious devil, aren't you, said Tommy. But you've forgotten one thing. May I light a cigarette, by the way? My poor little heart's going pit-a-pat. You may light a cigarette but no tricks. I am watching you, remember, with the pistol ready. I'm not a performing dog, said Tommy. I don't do tricks. He extracted a cigarette from his case, then felt for a matchbox. It's all right. I'm not feeling for a revolver. But you know well enough that I'm not armed. All the same, as I said before, you've forgotten one thing. What is that? Tommy took a match from the box, and held it ready to strike. I'm blind and you can see. That's admitted. The advantage is with you. But supposing we were both in the dark, eh? Where's your advantage then? He struck the match. The Duke laughed contemptuously. Thinking of shooting at the switch of the lights? Plunging the room into darkness? It can't be done. Just so, said Tommy. I can't give you darkness. Gut extremes meet, you know. What about light? As he spoke, he touched the match to something he held in his hand, and threw it down upon the table. A blinding glare filled the room. Just for a minute, blinded by the intense white light, the Duke blinked and fell back, his pistol hand lowered. He opened his eyes again to feel something sharp pricking his breast. Drop that pistol, ordered Tommy. Drop it quick. I agree with you that a hollow cane is a pretty rotten affair. So I didn't get one. A good sword stick is a very useful weapon, though. Don't you think so? Almost as useful as magnesium wire. Drop that pistol. Obedient to the necessity of that sharp point, the man dropped it. Then, with a laugh, he sprang back. But I still have the advantage, he mocked. For I can see, and you cannot. That's where you're wrong, said Tommy. I can see perfectly. This eye shade's a fake. I was going to put one over on tuppence. Make 1 or 2 bloomers to begin with, and then put in some perfectly marvelous stuff towards the end of the lunch. Why, bless you, I could have walked to the door and avoided all the knobs with perfect ease. But I didn't trust you to play a sporting game. You'd never have let me get out of this alive. Careful now. 4, with his face distorted with rage, the Duke sprang forward, forgetting in his fury to look where he put his feet. There was a sudden blue crackle of flame, and he swayed for a minute, then fell like a log. A faint odor of singed flesh filled the room, mingling with a stronger smell of ozone. "Whew," said Tommy. He wiped his face. Then, moving gingerly, and with every precaution, he reached the walk and touched the switch he had seen the other manipulate. He crossed the room to the door, opened it carefully, and looked out. There was no one about. He went down the stairs and out through the front door. Safe in the street, he looked up at the house with a shudder, noting the number. Then he hurried to the nearest telephone box. There was a moment of agonizing anxiety, and then a well-known voice spoke. "Tuppence, thank goodness. Yes, I'm all right. I got all your points. The fee, shrimp. Come to the Blitz and follow the 2 strangers." Albert got there in time, and when we went off in separate cars, followed me in a taxi, saw where they took me, and rang up the police. "Albert's a good lad," said Tommy. "Chivalrous. I was pretty sure he'd choose to follow you. But I've been worried, all the same. I've got lots to tell you. I'm coming straight back now. And the first thing I shall do when I get back is to write a thumping big check for St. Dunstan's. Lord, it must be awful not to be able to see." 11. The man in the mist. Tommy was not pleased with life. Blunt's brilliant detectives had met with a reverse, distressing to their pride if not to their pockets. Called in professionally to elucidate the mystery of a stolen pearl necklace at Adlington Hall, Adlington, Blunt's brilliant detectives had failed to make good. Whilst Tommy, hard on the track of a gambling countess, was tracking her in the disguise of a Roman Catholic priest, and Tuppence was getting off low with a nephew of the house on the golf links, the local inspector of police had unemotionally arrested the second footman, who proved to be a thief well known at headquarters and who admitted his guilt without making any bones about it. Tommy and Tuppence, therefore, had withdrawn with what dignity they could muster, and were at the present moment solacing themselves with cocktails at the Grand Adlington Hotel. Tommy still wore his clerical disguise. "Hardly a Father Brown touch, that," he remarked gloomily. "And yet I've got just the right kind of umbrella." "It wasn't a Father Brown problem," said Tuppence. "One needs a certain atmosphere from the start. One must be doing something quite ordinary, and then bizarre things begin to happen. That's the idea." "Unfortunately," said Tommy, "we have to return to town. Perhaps something bizarre will happen on the way to the station." He raised the glass he was holding to his lips, but the liquid in it was suddenly spilled, as a heavy hand smacked him on the shoulder, and a voice to match the hand boomed out words of greeting. "Upon my soul, it is old Tommy. And Mrs. Tommy too. Where did you blow in from? Haven't seen or heard anything of you for years." "Why, it's Bulger," said Tommy, setting down what was left of the cocktail, and turning to look at the intruder, a big square-shouldered man of 30 years of age, with a round red beaming face, and dressed in golfing kit. "Good old Bulger." "But I say, old chap," said Bulger, whose real name by the way, was Mervyn Estcourt, "I never knew you'd taken orders. Fancy you a blinking parson." Tuppence burst out laughing, and Tommy looked embarrassed. And then they suddenly became conscious of a fourth person. A tall slender creature, with very golden hair and very round blue eyes, almost impossibly beautiful, with an effect of really expensive black topped by wonderful ermines, and very large pearl earrings. She was smiling. And her smile said many things. It asserted, for instance, that she knew perfectly well that she herself was the thing best worth looking at, certainly in England, and possibly in the whole world. She was not vain about it in any way, but she just knew, with certainty and confidence, that it was so. Both Tommy and Tuppence recognized her immediately. They had seen her 3 times in The Secret of the Heart, and an equal number of times in that other great success, Pillars of Fire, and in innumerable other plays. There was, perhaps, no other actress in England who had so firm a hold on the British public as Miss Gilda Glenn. She was reported to be the most beautiful woman in England. It was also rumored that she was the stupidest. "Old friends of mine, Miss Glenn," said Estcourt, with a tinge of apology in his voice for having presumed, even for a moment, to forget such a radiant creature. "Tommy, and Mrs. Tommy, let me introduce you to Miss Gilda Glenn." The ring of pride in his voice was unmistakable. By merely being seen in his company, Miss Glenn had conferred great glory upon him. The actress was staring with frank interest at Tommy. "Are you really a priest?" she asked. "A Roman Catholic priest, I mean. Because I thought they didn't have wives." Estcourt went off in a boom of laughter again. "That's good," he exploded. "You sly dog, Tommy. Glad he hasn't renounced you, Mrs. Tommy, with all the rest of the pomps and vanities." Gilda Glenn took not the faintest notice of him. She continued to stare at Tommy with puzzled eyes. "Are you a priest?" she demanded. "Very few of us are what we seem to be," said Tommy gently. "My profession is not unlike that of a priest. I don't give absolution, but I listen to confessions." "Don't you listen to him," interrupted Estcourt. "He's pulling your leg. If you're not a clergyman, I don't see why you're dressed up like one," she puzzled. "That is, unless not a criminal flying from justice," said Tommy. "The other thing." "Oh," she frowned, and looked at him with beautiful bewildered eyes. "I wonder if she'll ever get that," thought Tommy to himself. Not unless I put it in words of one syllable for her, I should say. Aloud he said, know anything about the trains back to town, Bulger? We've got to be pushing for home. How far is it to the station? 10 minutes walk. But no hurry. Next train up is the 6.35 and it's only about 20 to 6 now. You've just missed one. Which way is it to the station from here? Sharp to the left when you turn out of the hotel. Then let me see, down Morgan's Avenue would be the best way, wouldn't it? Morgan's Avenue. Miss Glenn started violently, and stared at him with startled eyes. I know what you're rethinking of, said Estcourt, laughing the ghost. Morgan's Avenue is bounded by the cemetery on one side, and tradition has it that a policeman who met his death by violence gets up and walks on his old beat up and down Morgan's Avenue. A spook policeman. Can you beat it? But lots of people swear to having seen him. A policeman, said Miss Glenn. She shivered a little. But there aren't really any ghosts, are there? I mean, there aren't such things. She got up, folding her wrap tighter round her. Goodbye, she said vaguely. She had ignored Tuppence completely throughout, and now she did not even glance in her direction. But over her shoulder she threw one puzzled, questioning glance at Tommy. Just as she got to the door, she encountered a tall man with gray hair and a puffy red face who uttered an exclamation of surprise. His hand on her arm, he led her through the doorway, talking in an animated fashion. Beautiful creature, isn't she? Said Estcourt. Brains of a rabbit. Rumor has it that she's going to marry Lord Leconberry. That was Leconberry in the doorway. He doesn't look a very nice sort of man to marry, remarked Tuppence. Estcourt shrugged his shoulders. A title has a kind of glamour still, I suppose, he said. And Leconberry is not an impoverished peer by any means. She'll be in clover. Nobody knows where she sprang from. Pretty near the gutter, I dare say. There's something deuced mysterious about her being down here anyway. She's not staying at the hotel. And when I tried to find out where she was staying, she snubbed me quite crudely, in the only way she knows. Blessed if I know what it's all about. He glanced at his watch and uttered an exclamation. I must be off. Jolly glad to have seen you two again. We must have a bust in town together some night. So long. He hurried away, and as he did so, a page approached with a note on a salver. The note was unaddressed. But it's for you, sir, he said to Tommy. From Miss Gilda Glenn. Tommy tore it open and read it with some curiosity. Inside were a few lines written in a straggling, untidy hand. I'm not sure, but I think you might be able to help me. And you'll be going that way to the station. Could you be at the White House, Morgan's Avenue, at 10 minutes past 6? Yours sincerely, Gilda Glenn. Tommy nodded to the page who departed, and then handed the note to Tuppence. Extraordinary, said Tuppence. Is it because she still thinks you're a priest? No, said Tommy thoughtfully. I should say it's because she's at last taken in that 11M01. Hello. What's this? This was a young man with flaming red hair, a pugnacious jaw and appallingly shabby clothes. He had walked into the room and was now striding up and down muttering to himself. Hell, said the red-haired man, loudly and forcibly. That's what I say, hell. He dropped into a chair near the young couple and stared at them moodily. Damn all women, that's what I say, said the young man, eyeing Tuppence ferociously. Oh. All right, kick up a row if you like. Have me turned out of the hotel. It won't be for the first time. Why shouldn't we say what we think? Why should we go about bottling up our feelings, and smirking, and saying things exactly like everyone else? I don't feel pleasant and polite. I feel like getting hold of someone round the throat and gradually choking them to death. He paused. Any particular person? Asked Tuppence. Or just anybody? One particular person, said the young man grimly. This is very interesting, said Tuppence. Won't you tell us some more? My name's Riley, said the red-haired man. James Riley. You may have heard it. I wrote a little volume of pacifist poems, good stuff, although I say so. Pacifist poems, said Tuppence. Yes, why not? Demanded Mr. Riley belligerently. Oh. Nothing, said Tuppence hastily. I'm for peace all the time, said Mr. Riley fiercely. To hell with war. And women. Women. Did you see that creature who was trailing around here just now? Gilda Glenn, she calls herself. Gilda Glenn. God. How I've worshipped that woman. And I'll tell you this, if she's got a heart at all, it's on my side. She cared once for me, and I could make her care again. And if she sells herself to that muck heap Lecanberry, well, God help her. I'd as soon kill her with my own hands. And on this, suddenly, he rose and rushed from the room. Tommy raised his eyebrows. A somewhat excitable gentleman, he murmured. Well, Tuppence, shall we start? A fine mist was coming up as they emerged from the hotel into the cool outer air. Obeying Estcourt's directions, they turned sharp to the left, and in a few minutes they came to a turning labeled Morgan's Avenue. The mist had increased. It was soft and white, and hurried past them in little eddying drifts. To their left was the high wall of the cemetery, on their right a row of small houses. Presently these ceased, and a high hedge took their place. Tommy, said Tuppence. I'm beginning to feel jumpy. The mist and the silence. As though we were miles from anywhere. One does feel like that, agreed Tommy. All alone in the world. It's the effect of the mist, and not being able to see ahead of one. Tuppence nodded. Just our footsteps echoing on the pavement. What's that? What's what? I thought I heard other footsteps behind us. You'll be seeing the ghost in a minute if you work yourself up like this, said Tommy kindly. Don't be so nervy. Are you afraid the spook policeman will lay his hand on your shoulder? Tuppence emitted a shrill squeal. Don't, Tommy. Now you've put it into my head. She craned her head back over her shoulder, trying to peer into the white veil that was wrapped all round them. There they are again, she whispered. No, they're in front now. Oh. Tommy, don't say you can't hear them. I do hear something. Yes, it's footsteps behind us. Somebody else walking this way to catch the train. I wonder. He stopped suddenly, and stood still, and Tuppence gave a gasp, for the curtain of mist in front of them suddenly parted in the most artificial manner, and there, not 20 feet away, a gigantic policeman suddenly appeared, as though materialized out of the fog. 1 minute he was not there, the next minute he was, so at least it seemed to the rather superheated imaginations of the two watchers. Then as the mist rolled back still more, a little scene appeared, as though set on a stage. The big blue policeman, a scarlet pillar box, and on the right of the road the outlines of a white house. Red, white, and blue, said Tommy. It's demmed pictorial. Come on, Tuppence, there's nothing to be afraid of. For, as he had already seen, the policeman was a real policeman. And moreover, he was not nearly so gigantic as he had at first seemed looming up out of the mist. But as they started forward, footsteps came from behind them. A man passed them, hurrying along. He turned in at the gate of the White House, ascended the steps, and beat a deafening tattoo upon the knocker. He was admitted just as they reached the spot where the policeman was standing staring after him. There's a gentleman seems to be in a hurry, commented the policeman. He spoke in a slow reflective voice, as of one whose thoughts took some time to mature. He's the sort of gentleman always would be in a hurry, remarked Tommy. The policeman's stare, slow and rather suspicious, came round to rest on his face. Friend of yours? He demanded, and there was distinct suspicion now in his voice. No, said Tommy. He's not a friend of mine, but I happen to know who he is. Name of Riley. Al, said the policeman. Well, I'd better be getting along. Can you tell me where the White House is? Asked Tommy. The constable jerked his head sideways. This is it. Mrs. Honeycott's. He paused, and added, evidently with the idea of giving them valuable information, nervous party. Always suspecting burglars is around. Always asking me to have a look around the place. Middle-aged women get like that. Middle-aged, said Tommy. Do you happen to know if there's a young lady staying there? A young lady, said the policeman, ruminating. A young lady. No, I can't say I know anything about that. She mayn't be staying here, Tommy, said Tuppence. And anyway, she mayn't be here yet. She could only have started just before we did. Al, said the policeman suddenly. Now that I call it to mind, a young lady did go in at this gate. I saw her as I was coming up the road. About 3 or 4 minutes ago it might be. With ermine furs on? Asked Tuppence eagerly. She had some kind of white rabbit round her throat, admitted the policeman. Tuppence smiled. The policeman went on in the direction from which they had just come, and they prepared to enter the gate of the White House. Suddenly a faint muffled cry sounded from inside the house, and almost immediately afterwards the front door opened and James Riley came rushing down the steps. His face was white and twisted, and his eyes glared in front of him unseeingly. He staggered like a drunken man. He passed Tommy and Tuppence as though he did not see them, muttering to himself with a kind of dreadful repetition. My God! My God! Oh, my God! He clutched at the gate post, as though to steady himself, and then, as though animated by sudden panic, he raced off down the road as hard as he could go in the opposite direction to that taken by the policeman. 12 The man in the mist, continued. Tommy and Tuppence stared at each other in bewilderment. Well, said Tommy, something's happened in that house to scare our friend Riley pretty badly. Tuppence drew her finger absently across the gate post. He must have put his hand on some wet red paint somewhere, she said idly. Him, said Tommy. I think we'd better go inside rather quickly. I don't understand this business. In the doorway of the house a white-capped maidservant was standing, almost speechless with indignation. Did you ever see the likes of that now, father? She burst out, as Tommy ascended the steps. That fellow comes here, asks for the young lady, rushes upstairs without how or by your leave. She lets out a screech like a wild cat, and what wonder, poor pretty dear, and straightway he comes rushing down again, with the white face on him, like one who's seen a ghost. What will be the meaning of it all? Who are you talking with at the front door, Ellen? Demanded a sharp voice from the interior of the hall. Here's Mrs., said Ellen, somewhat unnecessarily. She drew back and Tommy found himself confronting a gray-haired, middle-aged woman, with frosty blue eyes imperfectly concealed by pince-nez, and a spare figure clad in black with bugle trimming. Mrs. Honeycutt, said Tommy. I came here to see Miss Glenn. Mrs. Honeycutt gave him a sharp glance, then went on to Tuppence and took in every detail of her appearance. Oh. You did you? She said. Well, you'd better come inside. She led the way into the hall and along it into a room at the back of the house facing on the garden. It was a fair-sized room, but looked smaller than it was, owing to the large amount of chairs and tables crowded into it. A big fire burned in the grate, and a chintz-covered sofa stood at one side of it. The wallpaper was a small gray stripe with a festoon of roses round the top. Quantities of engravings and oil paintings covered the walls. It was a room almost impossible to associate with the expensive personality of Miss Gilda Glenn. Sit down, said Mrs. Honeycutt. To begin with, you'll excuse me if I say I don't hold with the Roman Catholic religion. Never did I think to see a Roman Catholic priest in my house. But if Gilda's gone over to the Scarlet Woman, it's only what's to be expected in a life like hers, and I dare say it might be worse. She mightn't have any religion at all. I should think more of Roman Catholics if their priests were married. I always speak my mind. And to think of those convents, quantities of beautiful young girls shut up there, and no one knowing what becomes of them, well, it won't bear thinking about. Mrs. Honeycutt came to a full stop, and drew a deep breath. Without entering upon a defense of the celibacy of the priesthood or the other controversial points touched upon, Tommy went straight to the point. I understand, Mrs. Honeycutt, that Miss Glenn is in this house. She is. Mind you, I don't approve. Marriage is marriage and your husband's your husband. As you make your bed, so you must lie on it. I don't quite understand, began Tommy, bewildered. I thought as much. That's the reason I brought you in here. You can go up to Gilda after I've spoken my mind. She came to me after all these years, think of it, and asked me to help her. Wanted me to see this man and persuade him to agree to a divorce. I told her straight out I'd have nothing whatever to do with it. Divorce is sinful. God, I couldn't refuse my own sister shelter in my house, could I now? Your sister, exclaimed Tommy. Yes, Gilda's my sister. Didn't she tell you? Tommy stared at her open-mouthed. The thing seemed fantastically impossible. Then he remembered that the angelic beauty of Gilda Glenn had been in evidence for many years. He had been taken to see her act as quite a small boy. Yes, it was possible after all. But what a piquant contrast. So it was from this lower middle-class respectability that Gilda Glenn had sprung. How well she had guarded her secret. I am not yet quite clear, he said. Your sister is married. Ran away to be married as a girl of 17, said Miss Honeycutt succinctly. Some common fellow far below her in station. And our father a reverend. It was a disgrace. Then she left her husband and went on the stage. Play acting. I've never been inside a theater in my life. I hold no truck with wickedness. Now, after all these years, she wants to divorce the man. Means to marry some bigwig, I suppose. God, her husband's standing firm not to be bullied and not to be bribed. I admire him for it. What is his name? Asked Tommy suddenly. That's an extraordinary thing now, but I can't remember. It's nearly 20 years ago, remember, since I heard it. My father forbade it to be mentioned. And I've refused to discuss the matter with Gilda. She knows what I think, and that's enough for her. It wasn't Riley, was it? Might have been. I really can't say. It's gone clean out of my head. The man I mean was here just now. That man. I thought he was an escaped lunatic. I'd been in the kitchen giving orders to Ellen. I'd just got back into this room, and was. Of violent words, remember. He just saw red and he had his truncheon handy. 13 the crackler tuppence, said Tommy, we shall have to move into a much larger office. Nonsense, said Tuppence, you mustn't get swollen-headed and think you are a millionaire just because you solved 2 or 3 twopenny halfpenny cases with the aid of the most amazing luck. What some call luck, others call skill. Of course, if you really think you are Sherlock Holmes, Thorndyke, McCarty, and the brothers Oakwood all rolled into one, there is no more to be said. Personally, I would much rather have luck on my side than all the skill in the world. Perhaps there is something in that, conceded Tommy. All the same, Tuppence, we do need a larger office. Why? The classics, said Tommy. We need several hundreds of yards of extra bookshelf if Edgar Wallace is to be properly represented. We haven't had an Edgar Wallace case yet. I am afraid we never shall, said Tommy. If you notice, he never does give the amateur sleuth much of a chance. It is all stern Scotland Yard kind of stuff, the real thing and no base counterfeit. Albert, the office boy, appeared at the door. Inspector Marriott to see you, he announced. The mystery man of Scotland Yard, murmured Tommy. The busiest of the busies, said Tuppence. Or is it noses? I always get mixed between busies and noses. The inspector advanced upon them with a beaming smile of welcome. Well, and how are things? He asked breezily. None the worse for our little adventure the other day. Oh. Rather not, said Tuppence. Too marvelous, wasn't it? Well, I don't know that I would describe it exactly that way myself, said Marriott cautiously. What has brought you here today, Marriott? Asked Tommy. Not just solicitude for our nervous systems, is it? No, said the inspector. It is work for the brilliant Mr. Blunt. Ha, said Tommy. Let me put my brilliant expression on. I have come to make you a proposition, Mr. Beresford. What would you say to rounding up a really big gang? Is there such a thing? Asked Tommy. What do you mean, is there such a thing? I always thought that gangs were confined to fiction like master crooks and super criminals. The master crook isn't very common, agreed the inspector. But Lord bless you, sir, there's any amount of gangs knocking about. I don't know that I should be at my best dealing with a gang, said Tommy. The amateur crime, the crime of quiet family life, that is where I flatter myself that I shine. Drama of strong domestic interest. That's the thing with tuppence at hand to supply all those little feminine details which are so important, and so apt to be ignored by the denser male. His eloquence was arrested abruptly, as tuppence threw a cushion at him and requested him not to talk nonsense. "We'll have your little bit of fun, won't you, sir?" said Inspector Marriott, smiling paternally at them both. "If you'll not take offense at my saying so, it's a pleasure to see two people enjoying life as much as you two do." "Do we enjoy life?" said tuppence, opening her eyes very wide. "I suppose we do. I've never thought about it before." "To return to that gang you were talking about," said Tommy. "In spite of my extensive private practice, duchesses, millionaires, and all the best charwomen, I might perhaps condescend to look into the matter for you. I don't like to see Scotland Yard at fault. You'll have the Daily Mail after you before you know where you are. As I said before, you must have your bit of fun. Well, it's like this." Again he hitched his chair forward. "There's any amount of forged notes going about just now, hundreds of 'em. The amount of counterfeit treasury notes in circulation would surprise you. Most artistic bit of work it is. Here's one of 'em." He took a £1 note from his pocket and handed it to Tommy. "Looks all right, doesn't it?" Tommy examined the note with great interest. "By Jove, I'd never spot there was anything wrong with that. No more would most people. Now here's a genuine one. I'll show you the differences, very slight they are, but you'll soon learn to tell them apart. Take this magnifying glass." At the end of 5 minutes coaching, both Tommy and tuppence were fairly expert. "What do you want us to do, Inspector Marriott?" asked tuppence. "Just keep our eyes open for these things." "A great deal more than that, Mrs. Beresford. I'm pinning my faith on you to get to the bottom of the matter. You see, we've discovered that the notes are being circulated from the West End. Somebody pretty high up in the social scale is doing the distributing. They're passing them the other side of the channel as well. Now there's a certain person who is interesting us very much. A Major Laidlaw, perhaps you've heard the name." "I think I have," said Tommy. "Connected with racing, isn't that it?" "Yes. Major Laidlaw is pretty well known in connection with the turf. There's nothing actually against him, but there's a general impression that he's been a bit too smart over one or two rather shady transactions. Men in the know look queer when he's mentioned. Nobody knows much of his past or where he came from. Hell's got a very attractive French wife who's seen about everywhere with a train of admirers. They must spend a lot of money, the Laidlaws, and I'd like to know where it comes from." "Possibly from the train of admirers," suggested Tommy. "That's the general idea. But I'm not so sure. It may be coincidence, but a lot of notes have been forthcoming from a certain very smart little gambling club which is much frequented by the Laidlaws and their set. This gambling set get rid of a lot of loose money in notes. There couldn't be a better way of getting it into circulation. And where do we come in?" "This way. Young St. Vincent and his wife are friends of yours, I understand. They're in pretty thick with the Laidlaw set, though not as thick as they were. Through them it will be easy for you to get a footing in the same set in a way that none of our people could attempt. There's no likelihood of their spotting you. You'll have an ideal opportunity. What have we got to find out exactly? Where they get the stuff from, if they are passing it." "Quite so," said Tommy. "Major Laidlaw goes out with an empty suitcase. When he returns it is crammed to the bursting point with treasury notes. How is it done? I sleuth him and find out. Is that the idea?" "More or less. Gut, don't neglect the lady, and her father, am here a lot. Remember, the notes are being passed on both sides of the channel." "My dear Marriott," exclaimed Tommy reproachfully. "Blunt's brilliant detectives do not know the meaning of the word neglect." The inspector rose. "Well, good luck to you," he said, and departed. "Slush," said tuppence enthusiastically. Said Tommy, perplexed. "Counterfeit money," explained tuppence. "It is always called slush. I know 11M right." "Oh, Tommy, we have got an Edgar Wallace case. At last we are busies. We are, said Tommy, and we are out to get the crackler and we will get him good. Did you say the cackler or the crackler? The crackler. Oh, what is a crackler? A new word that I have coined, said Tommy. Descriptive of one who passes false notes into circulation. Bank notes crackle, therefore he is called a crackler. Nothing could be more simple. That is rather a good idea, said Tuppence, it makes it seem more real. I like the rustler myself. Much more descriptive and sinister. No, said Tommy, I said the crackler first and I stick to it. I shall enjoy this case, said Tuppence. Lots of nightclubs and cocktails in it. I shall buy some eyelash black tomorrow. Your eyelashes are black already, objected her husband. I could make them blacker, said Tuppence, and cherry lipstick would be useful too. That ultra bright kind. Tuppence, said Tommy, you're a real rake at heart. What a good thing it is that you are married to a sober steady middle-aged man like myself. You wait, said Tuppence. When you have been to the Python Club a bit you mayn't be so sober yourself. Tommy produced from a cupboard various bottles, 2 glasses, and a cocktail shaker. Let's start now, he said. We are after you, crackler, and we mean to get you. 14 The crackler, continued, making the acquaintance of the Laidlaws proved an easy affair. Tommy and Tuppence, young, well-dressed, eager for life and with apparently money to burn, were soon made free of that particular coterie in which the Laidlaws had their being. Major Laidlaw was a tall fair man, typically English in appearance, with a hearty sportsmanlike manner, slightly belied by the hard lines round his eyes and the occasional quick sideways glance that assorted oddly with his supposed character. He was a very dexterous card player, and Tommy noticed that when the stakes were high he seldom rose from the table a loser. Marguerite Laidlaw was quite a different proposition. She was a charming creature, with the slenderness of a wood nymph and the face of a Grote picture. Her dainty broken English was fascinating, and Tommy felt that it was no wonder most men were her slaves. She seemed to take a great fancy to Tommy from the first, and playing his part, he allowed himself to be swept into her train. My Tommy, she would say. But positively I cannot go without my Tommy. His air, eetees the color of the sunset, eeseet not. Her father was a more sinister figure. Very correct, very upright, with his little black beard and his watchful eyes. Tuppence was the first to report progress. She came to Tommy with 10 £1 notes. Have a look at these. They're wrong UNS, aren't they? Tommy examined them and confirmed. Tuppence's diagnosis. Where did you get them from? That boy, Jimmy Falconer. Marguerite Laidlaw gave them to him to put on a horse for her. I said I wanted small notes, and gave him a tenner in exchange. All new and crisp, said Tommy thoughtfully. They can't have passed through many hands. I suppose young Falconer is all right. Jimmy? Oh. He's a dear. He and I are becoming great friends. So I have noticed, said Tommy coldly. Do you really think it is necessary? Oh. It isn't business, said Tuppence cheerily. It's pleasure. He's such a nice boy. I'm glad to get him out of that woman's clutches. You've no idea of the amount of money she's cost him. It looks to me as though he were getting rather a pash for you, Tuppence. I've thought the same myself sometimes. It's nice to know one's still young and attractive, isn't it? Your moral tone, Tuppence, is deplorably low. You look at these things from the wrong point of view. I haven't enjoyed myself so much for years, declared Tuppence shamelessly. And anyway, what about you? Do I ever see you nowadays? Aren't you always living in Marguerite Laidlaw's pocket? Business, said Tommy crisply. But she is attractive, isn't she? Not my type, said Tommy. I don't admire her. Liar, laughed Tuppence. But I always did think I'd rather marry a liar than a fool. I suppose, said Tommy, that there's no absolute necessity for a husband to be either. But Tuppence merely threw him a pitying glance and withdrew. Amongst Mrs. Laidlaw's train of admirers was a simple but extremely wealthy gentleman of the name of Hank Ryder. Mr. Ryder came from Alabama, and from the first he was disposed to make a friend and confidant of Tommy. "That's a wonderful woman, sir," said Mr. Ryder, following the lovely Marguerite with reverential eyes. "Plumb full of civilization. Can't beat la gay France, can you? When I'm near her, I feel as though I was one of the Almighty's earliest experiments. I guess he'd got to get his hand in before he attempted anything so lovely as that perfectly lovely woman." Tommy agreeing politely with these sentiments, Mr. Ryder unburdened himself still further. "Seems kind of a shame a lovely creature like that should have money worries." "Has she?" asked Tommy. "You betcha your life she has. Queer fish, Laidlaw. She's scared of him. Told me so. Daren't tell him about her little bills." "Are they little bills?" asked Tommy. "Well, when I say little. After all, a woman's got to wear clothes, and the less there are of them the more they cost, the way I figure it out. And a pretty woman like that doesn't want to go about in last season's goods. Cards too, the poor little thing's been mighty unlucky at cards. Why, she lost 50 to me last night." "She won 200 from Jimmy Falconer the night before," said Tommy drily. "Did she indeed? That relieves my mind some. By the way, there seems to be a lot of dud notes floating around in your country just now. I paid in a bunch at my bank this morning, and 25 of them were down and outers, so the polite gentleman behind the counter informed me. That's rather a large proportion. Were they new looking? New and crisp as they make 'em? Why, they were the ones Mrs. Laidlaw paid over to me, I reckon. Wonder where she got 'em from. One of these toughs on the racecourse as likely as not." "Yes," said Tommy. "Very likely. You know, Mr. Beresford, 11M new to this sort of high life. All these swell dames, and the rest of the outfit. Only made my pile a short while back. Came right over to Europe to see life." Tommy nodded. He made a mental note to the effect that with the aid of Marguerite Laidlaw Mr. Ryder would probably see a good deal of life and that the price charged would be heavy. Meantime, for the second time, he had evidenced that the forged notes were being distributed pretty near at hand, and that in all probability Marguerite Laidlaw had a hand in their distribution. On the following night he himself was given a proof. It was at that small select meeting place mentioned by Inspector Marriott. There was dancing there, but the real attraction of the place lay behind a pair of imposing folding doors. There were 2 rooms there with green baize-covered tables, where vast sums changed hands nightly. Marguerite Laidlaw, rising at last to go, thrust a quantity of small notes into Tommy's hands. "They are so bulky, Tommy, you will change them, yes? A big note. See my so sweet little bag, it bulges him to distraction." Tommy brought her the £100 note she asked for. Then in a quiet corner, he examined the notes she had given him. At least a quarter of them were counterfeit. But where did she get her supplies from? To that he had as yet no answer. By means of Albert's cooperation, he was almost sure that Laidlaw was not the man. His movements had been watched closely and had yielded no result. Tommy suspected her father, the saturnine M. hero lot. He went to and fro to France fairly often. What could be simpler than to bring the notes across with him? A false bottom to a trunk, something of that kind. Tommy strolled slowly out of the club, absorbed in these thoughts, but was suddenly recalled to immediate necessities. Outside in the street was Mr. Hank P. Ryder, and it was clear at once that Mr. Ryder was not strictly sober. At the moment he was trying to hang his hat on the radiator of a car, and missing it by some inches every time. "This god-darned hatched hand, this god-darned hatched hand," said Mr. Ryder tearfully. "Not like that in the States. Man can hang up his hat every night, sir. You're wearing 2 hats. Never seen a man wearing 2 hats ere before. Must be affect climate." "Perhaps I've got 2 heads," said Tommy gravely. "Show you have," said Mr. Ryder. "That share odd. That share remarkable fac. Let share have a cocktail. Prohibition that share what share done me in." I guess I'm drunk, constitutionally drunk. Cocktail schmixed angel kiss, that's Marguerite, lovely creature, FONO me too. Horse's neck, 2 martinis, 3 road to ruin schno, road to ruin mixed all in a beer tankard. Bet me I wouldn't I shade to hell, I shade dash, Tommy interrupted. That's all right, he said soothingly. Now what about getting home? No home to go to, said Mr. Ryder sadly, and wept. What hotel are you staying at? Asked Tommy. Can't go home, said Mr. Ryder. Treasure hunt. Swell thing to do. She did it. Whitechapel, White Harts, Whitehead Shoro to the grave dash, never mind that, said Tommy. Where are you dash? But Mr. Ryder became suddenly dignified. He drew himself erect and attained a sudden miraculous command over his speech. Young man, 11 telling you. Margie took me. In her car treasure hunting. English aristocracy all do it. Under the cobblestones. £500. Solemn thought, 'tis solemn thought. I'm telling you, young man. You've been kind to me. I've got your welfare at heart, sir, at heart. We Americans dash, Tommy interrupted him this time with even less ceremony. What's that you say? Mrs. Laidlaw took you in a car. The American nodded with a kind of owlish solemnity. To Whitechapel. Again that owlish nod. And you found £500 there? Mr. Ryder struggled for words. Yes, she did, he corrected his questioner. Left me outside. Outside the door. Always left outside. It's kinder sad. Outside, always outside. Would you know your way there? I guess so. Hank Ryder doesn't lose his bearings dash, Tommy hauled him along unceremoniously. He found his own car where it was waiting, and presently they were bowling eastward. The cool air revived Mr. Ryder. After slumping against Tommy's shoulder in a kind of stupor, he awoke clear-headed and refreshed. Say, boy, where are we? He demanded. Whitechapel, said Tommy crisply. Is this where you came with Mrs. Laidlaw tonight? It looks kinder familiar, admitted Mr. Ryder looking round. Seems to me we turned off to the left somewhere down here. That's it, that street there. Tommy turned off obediently. Mr. Ryder issued directions. That's it. Sure. And round to the right. Say, aren't the smells awful? Yes, past the pub at the corner sharp round, and stop at the mouth of that little alley. But what's the big idea? Hand it to me. Some of the oof left behind? Are we going to put one over on them? That's exactly it, said Tommy. We're going to put one over on them. Rather a joke, isn't it? I'll tell the world, assented Mr. Ryder. Though I'm just a mite hazed about it all, he ended wistfully. Tommy got out and assisted Mr. Ryder to alight also. They advanced into the alleyway. On the left were the backs of a row of dilapidated houses, most of which had doors opening into the alley. Mr. Ryder came to a stop before one of these doors. In here she went, he declared. It was this door, I am plumb certain of it. They all look very alike, said Tommy. Reminds me of the story of the soldier and the princess. You remember, they made a cross on the door to show which one it was. Shall we do the same? Laughing, he drew a piece of white chalk from his pocket and made a rough cross low down on the door. Then he looked up at various dim shapes that prowled high on the walls of the alley, one of which was uttering a blood-curdling yawl. Lots of cats about, he remarked cheerfully. What is the procedure? Asked Mr. Ryder. Do we step inside? Adopting due precautions we do, said Tommy. He glanced up and down the alleyway, then softly tried the door. It yielded. He pushed it open, and peered into a dim yard. Noiselessly he passed through, Mr. Ryder on his heels. Gee, said the latter. There's someone coming down the alley. He slipped outside again. Tommy stood still for a minute, then hearing nothing went on. He took a torch from his pocket and switched on the light for a brief second. That momentary flash enabled him to see his way ahead. He pushed forward and tried the closed door ahead of him. That too gave, and very softly he pushed it open and went in. After standing still a second and listening, He again switched on the torch, and at that flash, as though at a given signal, the place seemed to rise round him. 2 men were in front of him, 2 men were behind him. They closed in on him, and bore him down. "Lights!" growled a voice. An incandescent gas burner was lit. By its light Tommy saw a circle of unpleasing faces. His eyes wandered gently round the room and noted some of the objects in it. "Al," he said pleasantly. "The headquarters of the counterfeiting industry, if I am not mistaken." "Shut your jaw," growled one of the men. The door opened and shut behind Tommy, and a genial and well-known voice spoke. "Got him, boys?" "That's right. Now, Mr. Busy, let me tell you you're up against it." "That dear old word," said Tommy. "How it thrills me. Yes. I am the mystery man of Scotland Yard. Why, it's Mr. Hank Ryder. This is a surprise. I guess you mean that too. I've been laughing fit to bust all this evening leading you here like a little child. And you so pleased with your cleverness. Why, Sonny, I was on to you from the start. You weren't in with that crowd for your health. I let you play about for a while, and when you got real suspicious of the lovely Marguerite, I said to myself, now's the time to lead him to it. I guess your friends won't be hearing of you for some time. Going to do me in? That's the correct expression, I believe. You have got it in for me. You've got a nerve all right. Not we shan't attempt violence. Just keep you under restraint, so to speak." "I'm afraid you're backing the wrong horse," said Tommy. "I've no intention of being kept under restraint, as you call it." Mr. Ryder smiled genially. From outside a cat uttered a melancholy cry to the moon. "Banking on that cross you put on the door, Sonny," said Mr. Ryder. "I shouldn't if I were you. Because I know that story you mentioned. Heard it when I was a little boy. I stepped back into the alleyway to enact the part of the dog with eyes as big as cartwheels. If you were in that alley now, you would observe that every door in the alley is marked with an identical cross." Tommy drooped his head despondently. "Thought you were mighty clever, didn't you?" said Ryder. As the words left his lips a sharp rapping sounded on the door. "What's that?" he cried, starting. At the same time, an assault began on the front of the house. The door at the back was a flimsy affair. The lock gave almost immediately and Inspector Marriott showed in the doorway. "Well done, Marriott," said Tommy. "You were quite right as to the district. I'd like you to make the acquaintance of Mr. Hank Ryder, who knows all the best fairy tales. You see, Mr. Ryder," he added gently, "I've had my suspicions of you. Albert, that important-looking boy with the big ears is Albert, had orders to follow on his motorcycle if you and I went off joy-riding at any time. And whilst I was ostentatiously marking a chalk cross on the door to engage your attention, I also emptied a little bottle of valerian on the ground. Nasty smell, but cats love it. All the cats in the neighborhood were assembled outside to mark the right house when Albert and the police arrived." He looked at the dumbfounded Mr. Ryder with a smile. Then rose to his feet. "I said I would get you, Crackler, and I have got you," he observed. "What the hell are you talking about?" asked Mr. Ryder. "What do you mean, Crackler?" "You will find it in the glossary of the next criminal dictionary," said Tommy. "Etymology doubtful." He looked round him with a happy smile. "And all done without a nose," he murmured brightly. "Good night, Marriott. I must go now to where the happy ending of the story awaits me. No reward like the love of a good woman, and the love of a good woman awaits me at home. That is, I hope it does, but one never knows nowadays. This has been a very dangerous job, Marriott. Do you know Captain Jimmy Falconer? His dancing is simply too marvelous, and as for his taste in cocktails, yes, Marriott, it has been a very dangerous job. 15. The Sunningdale Mystery. Do you know where we are going to lunch today, Tuppence?" Mrs. Beresford considered the question. "The Ritz," she suggested hopefully. "Think again. That nice little place in Soho." "No." Tommy's tone was full of importance. "An ABC shop. This one, in fact." He drew her deftly inside an establishment of the kind indicated, and steered her to a corner marble-topped table. "Excellent," said Tommy with satisfaction, as he seated himself. "Couldn't be better. Why has this craze for the simple life come upon you?" demanded Tuppence. "You see, Watson, but you do not observe. I wonder now whether one of these haughty damsels would condescend to notice us? Splendid, she drifts this way. It is true that she appears to be thinking of something else, but doubtless her subconscious mind is functioning busily with such matters as ham and eggs and pots of tea. Chop and fried potatoes, please, miss, and a large coffee, a roll, and butter, and a plate of tongue for the lady." The waitress repeated the order in a scornful tone, but Tuppence leaned forward suddenly and interrupted her. "No, not a chop and fried potatoes. This gentleman will have a cheesecake and a glass of milk." "A cheesecake and a milk," said the waitress with even deeper scorn, if that were possible. Still thinking of something else, she drifted away. "Agam. That was uncalled for," said Tommy coldly. "But I'm right, aren't I? You are the old man in the corner? Where's your piece of string?" Tommy drew a long twisted mesh of string from his pocket, and proceeded to tie a couple of knots in it. Complete to the smallest detail, he murmured. "You made a small mistake in ordering your meal, though. Women are so literal-minded," said Tommy. "If there's one thing I hate, it's milk to drink, and cheesecakes are always so yellow and bilious looking." "Be an artist," said Tuppence. "Watch me attack my cold tongue. Jolly good stuff, cold tongue. Now then, I'm all ready to be Miss Polly Burton. Tie a large knot and begin." "First of all," said Tommy, speaking in a strictly unofficial capacity, "let me point out this. Business is not too brisk lately. If business does not come to us, we must go to business. Apply our minds to one of the great public mysteries of the moment. Which brings me to the point, the Sunningdale mystery." "Al," said Tuppence, with deep interest. "The Sunningdale mystery." Tommy drew a crumpled piece of newspaper from his pocket and laid it on the table. "That is the latest portrait of Captain Cecily as it appeared in the Daily Leader." "Just so," said Tuppence. "I wonder someone doesn't sue these newspapers sometimes. You can see it's a man, and that's all. When I said the Sunningdale mystery, I should have said the so-called Sunningdale mystery," went on Tommy rapidly. "A mystery to the police perhaps, but not to an intelligent mind." "Tie another knot," said Tuppence. "I don't know how much of the case you remember," continued Tommy quietly. "All of it," said Tuppence, "but don't let me cramp your style." "It was just over 3 weeks ago," said Tommy, that gruesome discovery was made on the famous golf links. 2 members of the club, who were enjoying an early round, were horrified to find the body of a man lying face downwards on the 7th tee. Even before they turned him over, they had guessed him to be Captain Cecily, a well-known figure on the links, and who always wore a golf coat of a peculiarly bright blue color. Captain Cecily was often seen out on the links early in the morning, practicing, and it was thought at first that he had been suddenly overcome by some form of heart disease. Gut examination by a doctor revealed the sinister fact that he had been murdered, stabbed to the heart with a significant object, a woman's hat pin. He was also found to have been dead at least 12 hours. That put an entirely different complexion on the matter, and very soon some interesting facts came to light. Practically the last person to see Captain Cecily alive was his friend and partner Mr. Hollaby of the Porcupine Assurance Co., and he told his story as follows. Cecily and he played around earlier in the day. After tea the other suggested that they should play a few more holes before it got too dark to see. Hollaby assented. Cecily seemed in good spirits, and was in excellent form. There is a public footpath that crosses the links, and just as they were playing up to the 6th green, Hollaby noticed a woman coming along it. She was very tall and dressed in brown, but he did not observe her particularly, and Cecily, he thought, did not notice her at all. The footpath in question crosses in front of the 7th tee, continued Tommy. The woman had passed along this, and was standing at the farther side, as though waiting. Captain Cecily was the first to reach the tee, as Mr. Hollaby was replacing the pin in the hole. As the latter came towards the tee, he was astonished to see Cecily and the woman talking together. As he came nearer, they both turned abruptly, Cecily calling over his shoulder, Shan't he be a minute?" The two of them walked off side by side, still deep in earnest conversation. The footpath there leaves the course, and passing between two narrow hedges of neighboring gardens comes out on the road to Windlesham. Captain Cecily was as good as his word. He reappeared within a minute or two, much to Hollyby's satisfaction, as two other players were coming up behind them, and the light was failing rapidly. They drove off, and at once Hollyby noticed that something had occurred to upset his companion. Not only did he fuzzle his drive badly, but his face was worried, and his forehead creased in a big frown. He hardly answered his companion's remarks, and his golf was atrocious. Evidently something had occurred to put him completely off his game. They played that hole and the eighth, and then Captain Cecily declared abruptly that the light was too bad and that he was off home. Just at that point there is another of those narrow slips leading to the Windlesham Road, and Captain Cecily departed that way, which was a short cut to his home, a small bungalow on the road in question. The other two players came up, a Major Barnard and Mr. Lecky, and to them Hollyby mentioned Captain Cecily's sudden change of manner. They also had seen him speaking to the woman in brown, but had not been near enough to see her face. All three men wondered what she could have said to upset their friend to that extent. They returned to the clubhouse together, and as far as was known at the time, were the last people to see Captain Cecily alive. The day was a Wednesday, and on Wednesdays cheap tickets to London are issued. The man and wife who ran Captain Cecily's small bungalow were up in town according to custom, and did not return until the late train. They entered the bungalow as usual, and supposed their master to be in his room asleep. Mrs. Cecily, his wife, was away on a visit. The murder of the captain was a 9 days' wonder. Nobody could suggest a motive for it. The identity of the tall woman in brown was eagerly discussed, but without result. The police were, as usual, blamed for their supineness most unjustly, as time was to show. For a week later, a girl called Doris Evans was arrested and charged with the murder of Captain Anthony Cecily. The police had had little to work upon. A strand of fair hair caught in the dead man's fingers, and a few threads of flame-colored wool caught in one of the buttons of his blue coat. Diligent inquiries at the railway station and elsewhere had elicited the following facts. A young girl dressed in a flame-colored coat and skirt had arrived by Maine that evening about 7 o'clock, and had asked the way to Captain Cecily's house. The same girl had reappeared again at the station, 2 hours later. Her hat was awry and her hair tousled, and she seemed in a state of great agitation. She inquired about the trains back to town, and was continually looking over her shoulder as though afraid of something. Our police force is in many ways very wonderful. With this slender evidence to go upon, they managed to track down the girl, and identify her as one Doris Evans. She was charged with murder, and cautioned that anything she might say would be used against her, but she nevertheless persisted in making a statement, and this statement she repeated again in detail, without any substantial variation, at the subsequent proceedings. Her story was this. She was a typist by profession, and had made friends one evening, in a cinema, with a well-dressed man who declared he had taken a fancy to her. His name, he told her, was Anthony, and he suggested that she should come down to his bungalow at Sunningdale. She had no idea then, or at any other time, that he had a wife. It was arranged between them that she should come down on the following Wednesday, the day, you will remember, when the servants would be absent and his wife away from home. In the end he told her his full name was Anthony Cecily, and gave her the name of his house. She duly arrived at the bungalow on the evening in question, and was greeted by Cecily, who had just come in from She-Links. Though he professed himself delighted to see her, the girl declared that from the first his manner was strange and different. A half-acknowledged fear sprang up in her, and she wished fervently that she had not come. After a simple meal which was already prepared, Cecily suggested going out for a stroll. The girl consenting, he took her out of the house, down the road, and along the islip onto the golf course. And then suddenly, just as they were crossing the 7th tee, he seemed to go completely mad. Drawing a revolver from his pocket, he brandished it in the air, declaring that he had come to the end of his tether. Everything must go. I'm ruined, done for. And you shall go with me. I shall shoot you first, then myself. They will find our bodies here in the morning side by side together in death. And so on, a lot more. He had hold of Doris Evans by the arm, and she, realizing she had to do with a madman, made frantic efforts to free herself, or failing that to get the revolver away from him. They struggled together, and in that struggle he must have torn out a piece of her hair and got the wool of her coat entangled on a button. Finally, with a desperate effort, she freed herself, and ran for her life across the golf links, expecting every minute to be shot down with a revolver bullet. She fell twice, tripping over the heather, but eventually regained the road to the station and realized that she was not being pursued. That is the story that Doris Evans tells, and from which she has never varied. She strenuously denies that she ever struck at him with a hatpin in self-defense, a natural enough thing to do under the circumstances, though, and one which may well be the truth. In support of her story, a revolver has been found in the furze bushes near where the body is lying. It had not been fired. Doris Evans has been sent for trial, but the mystery still remains a mystery. If her story is to be believed, who was it who stabbed Captain Cecily? The other woman, the tall woman in brown whose appearance so upset him? So far no one has explained her connection with the case. She appears out of space suddenly on the footpath across the links, she disappears along the slip, and no one ever hears of her again. Who was she? A local resident? A visitor from London? If so, did she come by car or train? There is nothing remarkable about her except her height. No one seems to be able to describe her appearance. She could not have been Doris Evans, for Doris Evans is small and fair, and moreover was only just then arriving at the station. The wife, suggested Tuppence. What about the wife? A very natural suggestion. But Mrs. Cecily is also a small woman, and besides Mr. Hollaby knows her well by sight, and there seems no doubt that she was really away from home. One further development has come to light. The Porcupine Assurance Co. is in liquidation. The accounts reveal the most daring misappropriation of funds. The reasons for Captain Cecily's wild words to Doris Evans are now quite apparent. For some years past, he must have been systematically embezzling money. Neither Mr. Hollaby, nor his son, had any idea of what was going on. They are practically ruined. The case stands like this. Captain Cecily was on the verge of discovery and ruin. Suicide would be a natural solution, but the nature of the wound rules that theory out. Who killed him? Was it Doris Evans? Was it the mysterious woman in brown? Tommy paused, took a sip of milk, made a wry face, and bit cautiously at the cheesecake. 16 The Sunningdale mystery, continued, of course, murmured Tommy. I saw at once where the hitch in this particular case lay, and just where the police were going astray. Yes, said Tuppence eagerly. Tommy shook his head sadly. I wish I did. Tuppence, it's dead easy being the old man in the corner up to a certain point. Gut the solution beats me. Who did murder the beggar? I don't know. He took some more newspaper cuttings out of his pocket. Further exhibits. Mr. Hollaby. His son. Mrs. Cecily. Doris Evans. Tuppence pounced on the last, and looked at it for some time. She didn't murder him anyway, she remarked at last. Not with a hat pin. Why this certainty?